With the level of debt that that the governments have taken on, and the idea of all the refinancing that's going to have to take place in order to pay this down, are we just certain to have inflation here quickly, or what are the effects of that massive debt that the governments have taken on, especially in the light of if the people who are buying our debt, that is China, maybe Japan, and if they kind of tighten down on the faucet, doesn't that really put us in a pinch?
Yeah, let me take that one, Dan. Yeah, Bob, that's a huge issue. That's just a huge issue. I know we've talked about this, and the level of debt that exists in the world is the single scariest thing I think I've seen since I've been in business. And I can't talk about anybody else, but from my standpoint, I pay more attention to that and the ramifications of that than anything else. I would rather not bet the farm on any particular scenario, but I'll tell you just how I see this right now, and maybe I'll change. There's the argument that China's going to pull the plug, but the problem with China pulling the plug is they pull their own plug. As soon as they pull the plug and stop funding our debt, we stop buying their goods, and when we stop buying their goods, they stop having people employed in China, and employment is the problem in China, not profits. They're interested in employment. So if they pull our plug, they wind up pulling their own plug, and that's a very cataclysmic situation as far as the Chinese government is concerned. But to take that in a different form, there's concern. What I see as my main concern is I think there's going to be a spot increase in interest rates. We're already seeing that in Greece. Greece, for example, couldn't turn their short-term debt over for less than 10%. I don't know how many buyers there are out there for Greece debt at 10%, but they had to pay 10%. They were paying 3%. Now they're paying 10%. That's a pretty devastating increase. I think as we start looking at this debt thing, the thing that bothers me the most is very close to home. It's right here. It's California. And it's the municipalities right here in California. It's the cities that we have here in California, all of which who have a lot of debt out. And we've had somebody talk to us about the priority of those cities, and I think everyone in this audience knows that there's not a city you live in that is financially solvent. Not one. I, for example, live in the city of Laguna Beach. And I think they've done a pretty good job, really. They found that they had a $6 million deficit, and so they started selling a bunch of stuff to cover the $6 million deficit, and they were just barely through the $6 million deficit, and they got a call from CalPERS that said, "Oh, incidentally, you guys owe us another $6 million for the deficit in the pension plans," which is a whole different thing. City of Huntington Beach is a nightmare. That's where I begin to worry, because the people that talked to us said, the cities have priorities. They can only cut back so far. And their first priorities are to pay what? Education? What were the priorities on that, Mark? They were going to... but paying on the bonds was not a priority.
Yeah. We actually, I think 2 or 3 of us saw the controller of California. This is the person with the checkbook. Makes the deposits, writes the checks. And yeah, he said that in order of priority, education gets the highest priority because of, I think it's Prop 98, some proposition that says they have to spend 51 or 52% of the entire budget on education. But once they start making cuts, it first goes to corrections, then it goes to first responders, then it goes to the debt, and then it goes to education. And one of the most troublesome things, and this is, I'm going to need a glass of wine after this statement, that he said is that the state has been borrowing from every single source that they can. They've robbed Peter to pay Paul. They're taking from special funds like the forestry fund and the oil spill fund. They've taken 30% apparently from the local cities and counties. Their property tax have been held back just to fund this deficit. And that's on top of the $19 billion deficit, okay? So, but that's not the most alarming thing I heard. The most alarming thing I heard was that they have to pay it back in 2 years. There's a statute or some sort of mandate that requires them to pay it back. So, you know, it's just like Dick said, it doesn't fall far from the tree. California is probably a test case of a lot of things going on in the world, in the country, because we've got massive pension costs, overspending. But the problem is they can only make so many cuts. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. And it's definitely going to be interesting because they've been kicking the can down the street for a long time.
By the way, Mark's nickname in the office is Buzzkill.
Yeah, we were going to try to keep this a little bit light tonight. You know, going back to the federal situation, one of the things that's fascinating to me and trying to assess where things are at, it's a great question, and it's not the only time we've had that question, is that for the first time, the amount of the debt and the way that the debt is configured for the United States, we don't owe the money back to ourselves like we did in the past. 50% of our federal debt is to foreigners, which means we have a little less control, a little less say as far as how the rules go. And so it is appropriate to be sensitive to some of our larger funders of the debt of our national economy. The other thing that's a little bit scary is as the debt wheel, if we could develop a pie chart for you tonight to show you the different components of debt. The problem, obviously, whether it's a credit card or whether it's the national debt, is you get to the point where you're paying so much interest on top of the debt to fund it. So there are certainly some things that are very dramatic in scope. The level of debt is at unseen levels. I think you're going to see, the Fed is scurrying about. You're going to hear a lot about this over the next 2 months as we go into the elections, and it's something we're keeping a very close eye on.
One more point on that, and to Bob's question. I think the big problem that we're going to have is trying to fund that deficit, and I think on spot areas and cities and municipalities and so forth, they're going to have to wind up paying a lot more interest to take care of their obligations. There's going to be some states that are in better financial situations, so it's going to be a spotty thing. It's going to be certain countries and certain municipalities that have to pay a lot more all of a sudden, and they're not going to have the money to pay it. But I think the overriding theme that I feel is it's not inflationary, it's deflationary. I think the debt is a deflationary thing, and how that's handled is we're just going to have to watch. And we're going to be ready to make adjustments. We got out of most of the California tax obligations quite a while ago. I don't know if we're right or wrong, but I don't want to own California bonds. We were criticized for doing that, but I'll let somebody else own them and worry about the problem. I don't see how they do it, but I think that's basically a deflationary thing, not an inflationary thing. That's how I see it. It may turn out some differently downstream, but it's going to be a ways off, I think, a couple of 3 years, maybe more.
Buzzkill here. No, actually, just to add on, and that is an important point about how we approach the investments. We probably have about 5 or 6 risks, that we are looking at that are kind of those. We can't really quantify the risk, but we know we don't want to be part of the worst case scenario, and so we get out. And so what are we doing instead? A lot of our clients are in very high tax brackets, and so we're buying a lot of national munis. We don't get the saving grace from the California, free California state tax, but at least we get the federal. We've been buying Texas bonds because Texas seems to have at least their balance sheet in a little better order. So that's kind of, the one positive here, or hopefully there's more, is that there's always opportunity to make money in any market. But first and foremost, it's to identify the risk and make sure you don't get blindsided by it. That's your philosophy, and that's our very first worry.